I'd like to tell you a story, and you're going to have to use your imagination. So you can just kind of like settle in to your chair wherever you are. You can just grab a seat and just use your imagination and think about a young man. A young man who isn't that much to look at. He's not super handsome, but he's got a passion in his eyes. He's smart, he's curious, he's intellectual. There's a vivaciousness about this man because he's been kind of transformed by a message. And this young man comes from a good family. He comes from good stock. He has a good mother and brothers and sisters, and he comes from a decent home. But the young man has been so impacted by this message that he wants to do something about it. And he's surrounded in this community of people who've also felt this compulsion, this need to share this message of this transformed life that they've experienced. And one particular friend in this group, I'm just going to take this off. One particular friend in this group, he's actually a little bit older, he's a little bit wiser. Now I can imagine this guy, he's kind of balding, maybe he's a little heavier set. He's a very jolly fellow, and his eyes are very bright, and he's got a very, very warm smile. And to see this man is to actually see one of the kindest people that you would ever have met. He's actually cousins with the young man, but he doesn't really play the role of cousin or friend as much as he plays the role of mentor. This older mentor fellow sees the passion of this young man. He sees his curiosity. He sees his skill. And so he invests in him. He looks out for him. He guides him. He champions him. He kind of makes space for him to kind of find his way. And more, he models for what it means to be a vivacious, life-giving, warm, happy, sharing, loving person. And so the young man and his mentor have a really strong relationship. And they're all part of this kind of community of people. Well, one day the mentor comes to the young man and he says, I have a proposition for you. The mentor says, I've been given an opportunity to go on a trip. Now the trip is far away, far from our community, far from our safety. And the trip's going to take us a long time, and there's going to be dangers on this trip, but this trip will be a trip of a lifetime. And I'm actually going with a partner. And the two of us have been commissioned by the community to kind of go out and to do a lot of this good, hope, love sharing work. We're going to go, we're going to feed people, we're going to help people, we're going to spread the message of love wherever we go, with whoever we meet, and we need an assistant. And so this jolly, kind, championing mentor asks the young man, would you come along and be our assistant? Well, this is an opportunity for a lifetime. Because where the young man lived, it was difficult to move around. It was hard to kind of jump from city to city, from place to place. It just wasn't that kind of culture, wasn't that kind of context. This is a trip of a lifetime. He knew the dangers, he knew the risks, but there was something deep inside of him that said, yes, I want to go. So he reaches his hand out and he shakes the mentor's hand and says, absolutely, sign me up. When do we leave? Well, preparations are made. This trip was going to take a lot of administrative work. Now, this young man had administrative skills. He was educated. He could read and write and count and organize. And so he spent the next weeks and months preparing for this trip. Excited, yearning. I will make a difference in the world, the young man thought. I will leave my mark wherever I go. Like young people who feel that kind of, I can change the world attitude, this energy and excitement, this young man felt that he was about to do something great with his life. So the days and weeks pass, the trip date's getting closer and closer. The mentor, the partner, and the young man begin their journey. They load up their stuff, they set the sails, as it were, and they go off on their trip. But, always a but. The trip was a disaster, at least for what the young man was expecting. It was way harder than he ever thought it would be. It was far more difficult than he ever thought it would be. The moment he left home, he felt that call back, that he was out of his comfort area. He was out of his element, as it were. And it was challenging, and there was hostility. Every community that they went to, there was difficulty, and people trying to run them out of town. The things that he tried to set up didn't work out the way he thought it would. And so very early on in the trip, the young man kept saying, I made a mistake. I can't be here. I can't do this. This is too difficult. I need to go home. The mentor recognized that there was the young man was at a breaking point. He could have pushed him. He could have said, no. You got to push through. You committed. You did this. You have to follow through. But the mentor knew him. He loved him. He said, okay, I see what's going on. The partner, with the friend of the mentor, the partner was a little less forgiving. But the moment and the time and the right spot in this trip, very early on, maybe a couple weeks in, we don't really know, maybe a month in, the young man takes a flight out of there. He goes home, deserts the trip, deserts the purpose of his trip, which was to spread hope, the hope that he had lost. A trip that required perseverance he didn't have. And so he went home. The young man's name was John Mark. And to fill out his story, we need to turn to the book of Acts. If you were a keen listener, maybe you picked up that this is John Mark from the New Testament. And his mentor was Barnabas. And Barnabas' partner was Paul. Now, to really understand what happens to John Mark, we can turn to Acts 15, and I'll read it from there. And so off they went to Antioch. On arrival, they gathered the church to read the letter. Now, by this point in the story, Barnabas and Paul had already returned home. That trip that John Mark had gone on was long over. They're back in Antioch, their community. The people were greatly relieved and pleased, and Judas and Silas, good preachers, both of them, strengthened their new friends with many words of courage and hope. Then it was time to go home, and they were sent off with their new friends with laughter and embraces all around to report back to those who had sent them. So they've come home with this great message. Paul and Barnabas are happily received by the community that commissioned them. And there's this love, and you can just hear and kind of feel the camaraderie of this community as they've wrapped around Paul and Barnabas. And so Paul and Barnabas, they stayed in Antioch, teaching and preaching the word of God. But they weren't alone. There's a number of teachers and preachers at that time in Antioch. And after a few days, Paul, he's like, there's so few people in history like Paul. Just ever going, like just a constant force of energy. Paul says to Barnabas, let's go back and visit all our friends in each of the towns we preach the word of God. Let's see how they're doing. That apostolic pastoral drive. Paul's like, you know what? We've been here a couple days. Let's go back. Let's revisit. Let's reform. Let's reroute our connections with each other. And so Barnabas, get this, wanted to take John along. The guy nicknamed Mark. He wants to take Mark back with him. The deserter, the guy who gave up, who left early in the first trip. And Paul wouldn't have it. He wasn't about to take a quitter who, as soon as the going got tough, had jumped ship on them in Pamphylia. This is interesting, an interesting insight in the New Testament, because these are two men. And Barnabas, we know, is like the encourager. He's a really happy, jolly, encouraging guy. That's kind of his second name, Barnabas the encourager. But tempers flared. And they ended up going their separate ways. Barnabas took Mark and sailed back for Cyprus, that first island that they went to. And Paul chose Silas, offered up by the friends, and the grace of the master went to Syria and Cilicia to put grit in those congregations. This one person that Barnabas had championed, that Barnabas had mentored, John Mark, caused such a disagreement between Paul and Barnabas that this super couple, this super team, actually got so angry with each other that they refused to work with one another. And they split all over John Mark. Paul, this very fastidious, strong, stalwart, like just a pillar of a man, unstoppable force. I don't want a quitter with me. Barnabas, the encourager, saw something past John Mark's failures. And he said, no, I put my confidence in him a second time. Let's take him. But they couldn't agree. They separate. And Barnabas and Mark go to Cyprus. Paul then chooses Silas, and the whole trajectory of the New Testament story changes. Now, the story that I shared in the beginning is actually a really fascinating story. It's not a story that you're going to find just jump off the pages of the New Testament. It's not just going to reach out to you. But we do know a lot about Mark through induction, through exegesis, through looking through the lines of the scriptures, for like piecing it together like a puzzle. We know that he's younger. We know that he's administrative. We know that he's skilled, that he's educated, that he can read, that he can write. He was asked to be an assistant, so he had some competencies. We know that he's eager and intelligent and thoughtful and passionate about his work with the gospel. But we also know there's something kind of that held him back, that he wasn't quite ready. And we know that disagreement on the docks when he sails back to Jerusalem, I can't imagine that Paul didn't let Mark go without chewing off his ear. But he went anyway. He went home anyway because of something inside of him. And at this point in the book of Acts, Barnabas and Mark fade off the page. Their story is done. It's over. The whole book, the whole narrative shifts to Paul as it's kind of following along Paul and Silas and all their ministries. We really don't hear anything more of any substance of what happened to Mark and what happened to Barnabas. Their story's over. Now, why do we tell stories? Why do we like stories as people? Now, I want to challenge you something. Maybe you say, well, I don't read The Hobbit. I'm not a big reader. I'm actually not a big storyteller. I don't really like stories. I want to challenge you to think of explaining your day without using a story. Stories are just very simple things. They're just a string of events and experiences woven together into a complete whole, a complete thought. All a story is an event, something that's happening, and an experience, how you process it, how you feel it, woven together into a complete coherent line, a complete coherent sentence. Sometimes stories aren't very coherent, but stories are everywhere. They're the language of people. I would love for you to try, I don't know that I could myself, describe yourself without storying. It would be as if I came to Blue Mountain Community Church and I didn't introduce myself. I didn't say where I came from or who my family is or where I live. I just gave you a list of just rote facts. 5'9", 1984, wife, 3 children, Chesley. Just a bunch of block facts. You'd be like, what are you talking about? You're off your gourd. No. I presented you as a story. My name is Amos Shelley. I was born here. I've got 3 kids. I live over there. Events, experiences, woven together into complete thought. Stories are human. You are all stories. In fact, stories are necessary because there's no possible way that we could kind of collect all the information that's around us constantly. We're not just a pile of organic goo or mush. We're not just a series of memories. We're not just a physical thing. We're spiritual, emotional, sociological, living beings. And the way that we understand one another The way we express truth to one another is through story. Now, this particular story is actually one of my favorites. And that's weird, because it's not actually a story in the Bible. It's actually past the narrative. You have to look beyond the story of what's given to you. You have to kind of fill in the blanks in this story. But it is a profound story. Because if you were to look at Acts and say, okay, Mark, you messed up. Barnabas, Mark, go off and do your thing. You're kind of written off the pages. We don't know what happens to them. We don't know where they go and what they do and how it's received. But at some point, something beautiful happens. This story of Mark takes shape. It takes a different turn. Mark, at some point later, and not long after, maybe a couple years, who knows, Mark comes home. He completes that missionary trip and he comes back. And something inside of him, his passion, his intuition, the Spirit of Jesus welling up deep inside, Mark goes to his study. Probably looks nothing like N.T. Wright's study. He goes somewhere, he picks up a quill and a blank parchment, and Mark begins to write. He begins to write a story. And he takes information from his mentors, his friends, the community that he's surrounded, from his very good companion, Peter. He takes things from his own memory, from the times that he was around some of these happenings and some of these stories, and he starts writing this compelling, raw, beautiful, just exciting story. And when he's done, after compiling and writing all this out, he rolls up his parchment and he puts a seal on the front with the name, The Gospel of Mark. The Good News according to Mark. Mark, after failing on his first missionary journey, after being the subject of Paul and Barnabas' conflict and splitting, sometime after, scholars are very, very confident that it's the same John Mark who went home and wrote the first gospel. Now, why is that? It's so compelling to me and so important because that Mark's gospel is actually one of the first written documents in the New Testament. There's some epistles probably flying around, some letters flying around at that point, but Mark's is the first gospel written. And it gives an insight into not only the stories of Jesus and the happenings of Jesus and the witness of Jesus, but like a really interesting and raw insight into the person of Jesus. And Mark's narrative is so compelling. It just flies off the page. And Mark knows now that he was once a failure. He was once a loser. He was once a quitter. Mark isn't writing for the high elites and the high educated like Paul. Mark's writing for the every person. And so his story is very accessible. And it's so accessible and it's so impacting that when Matthew and Luke and even John start writing their gospels, they use Mark as a reference. They use Mark as a guide. Mark's story makes a meteoric impact on human civilization. The Spirit of Jesus oozes out of that narrative. And from its conception, it has changed the way people tell stories. It has shaped all of our culture from that point to even this very moment. And I love this story because when it seems like Mark's story is over, when it seems like Mark has been written off the page, this story reminds me that our stories are not yet done being written. As individuals, as families, as communities, as churches, And why I think this story is so important for this moment for Blue Mountain Communities, because we are in a moment of transition, an enormous inflection point on history. And you can take a microscope and you can pan all the way down to the individual, and you can pan all the way back up to our country, to our world. We are in an inflection point in history, and it might feel like, oh my goodness, the story is over. Some of you know that lots of churches are struggling, that schools are struggling, that hospitals are struggling, that families are being split apart. You mean, oh my goodness, this story seems to be over. Maybe some of us I would love for this chapter to be finished. But what happens next? Looking at this story of Mark reminds me that our stories are not yet finished. As an individual, no matter how old you are, no matter how young you are, no matter how rich you are, no matter how poor you are, whether you're struggling with an illness, whether you're struggling with loneliness, whether you're surrounded by a big family, whether you have no one, your story is not yet finished. As a family, you might be reeling in pain. There may be a horrible tragedy or grief or difficulty. Our stories are not yet finished. Particularly, as an interim, as a transition pastor, I want to remind you and encourage you that as a church community, your story is not yet finished. You have a long, storied past of kindness and benevolence. Every time I sit down with one of you and hear the stories of this community, all I hear is care. Care and love for each other and for your community. It's beautiful. But it's not finished. Your story isn't finished. Who knows the direction in which this community will be written into the future? And that is a beautiful thing. And so there's only a couple things we have to do. I remember hearing this way back in Bible college from a missionary. And it's not novel. You may have heard it before. I had never heard it. I don't even know who said it. But this missionary said something really profound that struck me and stuck with me all these years later. He said, my only job in this story is to just be an obedient pencil and not wiggle too much in the master's hand. That's my job, this missionary said. And it struck me because God is writing his story through you, through your families, through this community. And it isn't finished being written. And all we have to do is have courage and trust the grand storyteller. And to just not wiggle too much. Because he will use you, he will use your family, he will use your situation, he will use your context. He will use this church community to tell his story. Maybe you feel like Mark at Acts 15. Maybe you feel like you've been written off the page. You know, I did my thing. I had my couple chapters, but it's over. I'm written out of this story now. I want to remind you and encourage you that if you're a follower of Jesus and you're eagerly following him and his spirit indwells in you, I want to remind you and encourage you that your story is not finished. And there's a beautiful tale that Jesus wants to tell through you and with you. In a moment, I'm going to invite you to kind of follow along in the words of Eugene Peterson, that our prayers are stories, that it makes sense to me now. As I shared earlier, I've been sitting with this for years. What do you mean prayer is story? I don't get it. Well, if I am a living thing experiencing events through a sequence of stuff, and my life is a living story, then my prayers are an expression of where I am in that story. And so the invitation to seek God, to ask the Spirit to participate, to help, to advocate in my life is an act of storing prayer. And so this morning, in a couple minutes, I'm going to hand it off to Jen. She's going to help facilitate this. That if you have prayers, requests See them as an extension of your life, of your story. And share them in a community of love and support and encouragement. And know that your story will be respected. Know that your prayers will be loved and upheld. And know that we're bringing them to the good Father in heaven who loves us through his Son, Jesus Christ. So let me pray, and then we will transition into our time of prayer together. Jesus, I thank you that you are the grand storyteller, and I thank you that from the beginning of time, you didn't flick your fingers and bring creation into existence. You didn't raise your hand and bring creation into existence. You spoke words, and the whole of the universe came into being. And Jesus, I thank you that at the very foundations of human existence, you spoke and you breathed breath of your life into our lungs. Jesus, I thank you from the very beginning. We've been a part of this grand, masterful story that you are telling. And I thank you so much that we can be participants in that. And that you came to earth and you died on a cross and you were risen again, and you offer us life and you offer us opportunity to be part of your story unfolding in history. And so I thank you now for this congregation. I thank you for this deep storied history of care and love in a community, and a care and a love for one another. What a tremendous legacy that they have to share with one another. And so I pray now that they would continue to lean into that they would recognize their past as being a community of love and care, and extend that forward to those that are with them presently, that those that drop on their heart, that they would know how to care, that they would know how to love, that they'd have the courage to share. And just even now I pray that as we share together in our requests and our storying prayers, that you would be with us, that you would guide the conversation, that you would give space to grieve and to hope and to dream. And we thank you for all these things in your name. Amen.